Hello everyone, this is PKO Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you. And following the recent announcement of Bruce Willis retiring from acting, I thought it'd be appropriate and fun to break down some of his best movies and performances throughout his career. And as I stated in a previous video, Bruce Willis in his prime was one of the biggest actors within the early to late 1990s, showing overall quite a big range in terms of his projects and performances alongside his action superstar status. Now, I already have some reviews of his movies within the channel, and I'll leave some links of those within the description so you can check those out at a later date. So the first movie I want to talk about within this breakdown is Last Man Standing from 1996, and overall this is a very impressive Prohibition era western adopting the famous Fistful of Dollars storyline, where we see Bruce Willis starring as John Smith, coming between two bootleg gangs in the desert town of Jericho. And overall this is a very atmospheric, stylish action movie full of intense, furious shootouts and sequences. And overall I think Bruce Willis is very good and solid in the lead role alongside Christopher Walken, who always delivers within his films. And overall it's very rich in its dryness and its tone, providing very much ambiguous characters, and it's very lean in its pacing alongside a fine musical score as well. So Last Man Standing is definitely a film worth checking out and a worthwhile entry within Bruce Willis's career. We go on to the next movie that I want to talk about, and that is Tears of the Sun from 2003. This is a very intense and compelling, exciting war drama as we see Bruce Willis heading a special platoon of soldiers who are sent in the conflict-ridden region of Nigeria to rescue US medical staff. They eventually find themselves under pursuit from militia. They make the ultimate decision to also rescue the Nigerian refugees, and they're constantly put under strain and struggle as they try to strive to the safe zone within the regions. And overall this is a very escalating story, and it's a very powerful movie as well, never shying away from showing the stark brutalities of war. And in terms of Bruce Willis himself, it's a very restrained and a very subtle performance. He has good support alongside Monica Bellucci, and this is a movie directed by Antoine Fuqua, who we all know directed the likes of Training Day, and he brings about a very vivid and brutally staged action and sequences, and the film looks visually great as well. So Tears of the Sun is definitely a film that I think was underrated in both its release and perception in terms of Bruce Willis's career, but it's definitely a movie that will keep you on the edge of your seat from start to finish. And alongside some amazing music from Hans Zimmer, this is definitely a movie that I would definitely consider a highlight within Bruce Willis's career. We then go on to the next movie that I want to include on this list, and that is Unbreakable from 2000. Teaming up again for the second time with both Samuel L. Jackson and director M. Night Shyamalan, Bruce Willis plays a security guard who, after surviving a train crash with no injuries, realises that he has super abilities and powers in what's for the most part a composed, mature, and to an extent a very spiritual take on a superhero story. Bruce Willis performs very well again, showcasing a different role towards his action persona at this time of release. And despite being let down by a very stupid ending and climax, Unbreakable remains a very compelling and a very different take, I would say, in terms of the typical formula genre that we would see this type of storyline put under. Now later on, Unbreakable would go on to be part of a trilogy with subsequent movies such as Glass and Split, but without question this is easily the best entry within those trilogy of films, and once again a standout entry within Bruce Willis's filmography. We go on to the next entry, which I think is a surprising choice for many, and that is Death Becomes Her from 1992. And this is very much of a comedic, entertaining movie where we see Bruce Willis playing Ernest, who's a mortician, and he's really torn between both Goldie Hawn and Meryl Streep, looking to maintain their immortality and also their body parts in many ways. And I can vividly remember watching this in the cinema, and it was very distinctive in terms of its special effects, where we would see constantly Goldie Hawn and Meryl Streep taking themselves apart, you know, blowing each other to bits, blowing holes in one another, ripping off each other's arms and limbs. And this was from Robert Zemeckis, who of course is a very inventive director, and we certainly saw that in terms of the special effects that we saw throughout this film. But this movie was also very insightful in terms of superficiality and materialism, and it's a very nice change in pace from Bruce Willis at the time, still feeding off the superstar status from the Die Hard films. This is very much more of a manic, very wacky tone and character that he plays throughout this role, and I think it once again shows his more comedic sensibilities that he very much started with, if you remember, early on throughout his career. We then go on to what I believe is one of the most underrated films in general, let alone Bruce Willis's career, and that is The Last Boy Scout from 1991. Such a great action movie from the early 1990s, This is Bruce Willis very much riffing off his John McClane persona as he plays Joe Hallenbach, who in the beginning was a disgraced security guard who saved the president, but once he spoke out against certain actions of a congressman, he gets dismissed from his job, and after years of depreciation he ends up being a broken down alcoholic private eye, teaming up with failed NFL quarterback Damon Wayans into investigating corrupt politicians and gangsters amongst the gambling operations within sports. Full of great one-liners and fast-paced action, I look at Last Boy Scout and the role that Bruce Willis plays as very much an older version of John McClane. He has some fantastic scenes when he's taken on the villains. He has great chemistry with Damon Wayans as well. And Last Boy Scout is one of those timeless films that you could stick on now and just watch it again and again and again. So rewatchable and so entertaining, and it really still doesn't get enough appreciation, I believe, many years after its release. It was also one of the best directed films, I believe, from Tony Scott as well. So a great entry on this list in Last Boy Scout, and definitely one of the best action films of the 1990s, alongside a great entry within Bruce Willis's career. Now, another fine entry that I want to talk about is 16 Blocks from 2006. This is very much a tense, action-packed, compelling thriller where we saw Bruce Willis playing again a very flawed alcoholic detective, Jack Mosley, at the end of his career, put on one final assignment to escort witness Eddie Bunker, played by Mos Def, to a courthouse 16 blocks away from the police department, and we suddenly find out that Eddie has to give testimony against certain corrupt cops who band together to try and assassinate him, and Jack has to protect Eddie all over the city as they're chased around in order to try and get him to provide his testimony. Now, of course, 16 Blocks was very significant as it was the final film within revered director Richard Donner's career, but it also remains a very lean, very tight, competent action thriller, very free of the blow and the fluff and the over-exposition as what we would see with so many action movies. And there was also a great chemistry and dynamic between both Bruce Willis and Mos Def, once again showing that Bruce Willis can play much more of these very deconstructive characters. And overall, Bruce Willis paints a very likeable and appealing character. And 16 Blocks again is a film that you are gripped on from the beginning scene all the way through to a very fine finish, and is yet again one of those movies that's sadly underrated and definitely deserves more praise at the time and also post its release as well. So a very fine action movie within 16 Blocks within Bruce Willis's career. The next movie we're going to talk about on this list is of course The Sixth Sense. Released in 1999, this was a massive supernatural blockbuster from that year where we saw Bruce Willis's psychologist trying to help child patient Haley Joel Osment, who was having visions of dead people. And this is without question one of the most famous films alongside The Matrix within the late 1990s. It was very notorious, of course, due to its sensational twist ending that I still believe holds up today as one of the best twist endings or climaxes within all of cinema. And this is again Bruce Willis showing more range and subtleties within his choice and his performance. Of course, the dynamic that he has with Haley Joel Osment is key, and it's not just about the climax. There's a lot of very dark, sinister tones and elements of horror throughout this film that always make it compelling, and even though you go back to watch it knowing the way that the film ends, it still remains a very fine piece of movie making. So I think most would agree when going over Bruce Willis's career that The Sixth Sense stands apart as one of the best movies throughout all of his films. And then to close out this breakdown, we have to of course talk about the Die Hard films, featuring Bruce Willis in his most iconic role as John McClane, completely redefined the action movie genre. The first film of course is still the best of the franchise, without question one of the most influential movies of the 1980s, and when I talk about it changing the action genre, it was really more from a conceptual point of view in terms of the action hero personality itself. Of course, Bruce Willis as John McClane was very much a contrast to the muscle-bound heroes that we saw dominating the decade of Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger. As John McClane, Bruce Willis very much created the more everyday man hero, who was far more flawed and vulnerable, relying on his quick reactions and his wit and his charisma to defeat the bad guys. It was very much his delivery and the dialogue and his personality that really makes the movie. It's one of those films where if you put any other actor within this film, it just doesn't have the same impact. In many ways we could say the same thing about Alan Rickman's classic villain, and it still holds up today. It's such a brilliant performance for what is still an amazing movie. And when I look overall at the sequels, I think for the most part they're very entertaining and watchable. Of course, we look at Die Hard 2, which stayed closer in spirit to the first film, this time John McClane taking on terrorists within an airport during Christmas. And whilst the style and surprise and novelty had of course washed off from the first film, I still love Die Hard 2 and I can watch it anytime. Die Hard with a Vengeance, of course, released in 1995, very much freshened up the novelty and the formula, this time setting most of the action within the day, as John McClane has to team up with Zeus, played by Samuel L. Jackson, as they have to chase bombs all over the city, set by Jeremy Irons, playing Hans Gruber's brother Simon. And whilst it's probably the most outlandish of the Die Hard films, it's so inventive and dynamic, very much feeding off the chemistry between both Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson, and a fine villain performance from Jeremy Irons. Alongside delivering lots of twists and turns, Die Hard with a Vengeance is a great entry within the Die Hard franchise, and in hindsight of course you wish they had stopped it there, but due to the big success of the franchise they had to continue. And I will say that the fourth film, Live Free or Die Hard, which was released in 2007, is still overall a very entertaining film to watch. This time we have an aged John McClane, very much out of his depth in a world relying on the internet and technology, this time having to combat cyber terrorists. And this movie he's partnered alongside Justin Long as they portray the city trying to track down the villain played by Timothy Olyphant alongside Maggie Q as well. So by this stage, McClane was starting to become far more of a super cop rather than the everyday man from the first three films. But despite that, there's still enough escapism and crazy action sequences to still make Live Free or Die Hard a very watchable actioner overall. The franchise had to end with the fifth movie, A Good Day to Die Hard, where we saw John McClane going to Russia, I believe, in order to rescue his son. And this is very much of a misfire in many sense. The franchise had long outstayed its welcome, stripping John McClane of his distinctive personality, and he's just very much more of a regular action hero at this stage. And overall, it was just a sad way to end what was very much of an iconic action franchise. So overall, that's it in terms of my breakdown of what I believe were overall the best and most notable films within Bruce Willis's career. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if needed we can have further debate and discussion. And if there are any other Bruce Willis films that you would like to see me provide for a more detailed review and commentary, then let me know within the comments, and if I've seen the films then I will also provide more reviews of those films as well. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very soon.